There is a great deal of misunderstanding surrounding the origins and nature of modern Russia. Misguided optimists treat Putin and his administration as an ally of the working people, while unknowing foreigners falsely identify the country as a communist state. Some even celebrate the birth of a new Russia, seeing it as a victory over communism. The purpose of this video is to demonstrate that the 1990s were by no means a time of celebration for the Russian people. The era left a permanent scar on all those who survived it, and continues to affect the makeup of the modern Russian state and the Russian economy. First, we will cover a basic timeline of the events that transpired in the 1990s. As tempting as it will be, we will not be moving too far back into the Soviet era, since that would open up a whole new topic that deserves its own video. This video is not about why the Soviet Union collapsed, but rather how the collapse occurred and what followed in its wake. It should also be noted that this video is focusing on Russia, which is one of the 15 Soviet republics that made up the whole Union. Covering all the republics would require a whole documentary series. After the timeline of events, we will move on to some of the consequences of the 90s in regards to Russian society, Russian politics, and the Russian economy. In 1989, legislative elections were held across the USSR. These elections were widely recognized as the first free elections in the Soviet Union. Whether or not that is the case is not the subject of today's discussion. What concerns us is the relative legitimacy the results had around the world. Taking a look at the outcome, we can quickly see the overwhelming support won by the communists. Even after 4 years of glasnost, a period in which there were no real repercussions for opposing the status quo, many people in the USSR continued to support the party. Skeptics might be tempted to suggest that this support is simply latent conditioning of the Soviet populace. To respond to that, we will monitor the relative popularity of left-wing politics as we move forward with the analysis. The next major electoral landmark was the 1990 elections, held in the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic. Here again, we see the vast majority of the votes supporting communist candidates in the elections. A year later, a nationwide referendum was held in the Soviet Union. Participants were asked if they supported the continuation of the Soviet Union as an entity. Nearly 78% of those who voted said they did. To be sure, a number of republics boycotted the referendum and subsequently voted for independence from the Union. By then, Moscow was losing its grip on a number of republics who were being engulfed in a wave of nationalist separatism. Nevertheless, 73% of the RSFSR voted to preserve the Soviet Union. In many southern republics, those in favor of the USSR consistently made up more than 90% of the population. It's time we acquainted ourselves with one of the most important figures of this era, Boris Yeltsin. Yeltsin was a member of the party who, by the late 80s and early 90s, openly advocated for liberalization and market reforms. He eventually came to be known as the leader of the liberal opposition. On the 12th of June 1991, Yeltsin was elected president of the RSFSR. At this point in time, Yeltsin was indeed a popular candidate, whose promise for change captured the attention of many disillusioned citizens. At the same time as Yeltsin's popularity rose, many high-level officials began to lose faith in Gorbachev's ability. A plan to dethrone the perceivably incompetent president of the Soviet Union was launched by a handful of hardline party members. The hope was to stop the collapse of the USSR and roll back many of the reforms Gorbachev initiated in 1985. On August 17, 1991, Gorbachev was put under house arrest, and shortly thereafter, the leaders of the developing coup ordered loyal troops to seize the main government building. The coup failed after facing resistance from crowds of people and suffering from disorganization. The failure of the coup was a huge blow to the legitimacy of Soviet authority. Shortly after, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was banned from the country, and the leaders of the coup were prosecuted. 3 of the coup leaders committed suicide, and others faced trial, but were later granted amnesty. These events gave Yeltsin and other nationalist leaders in the USSR the power and ability to make their final moves. One of the most important moments was a meeting between the Russian, Belarusian, and Ukrainian leaders in Belarus, where they signed a document claiming that the Soviet Union had ceased to exist. Some people still question the right that these 3 leaders had in ending the Soviet Union without a democratic process. But the fact remains that the actors were able to accrue enough de facto political power to make such a monumental decision on their own. The Belazheva Accords, as the event came to be known, also demonstrated that the republics in the USSR did not necessarily hold equal power by the time of its demise. As Yeltsin and his supporters came to power, the most important matter on the agenda became economic reforms. These reforms intended to liberalize the Russian economy and privatize public assets. Influenced heavily by tenets of neoliberalism, the new elite moved ahead with reforms that would prove to be catastrophic for the Russian people. The IMF and the United States played an integral role in the reforms that brought unadulterated capitalism to post-Soviet Russia. Almost immediately after Yeltsin's victory over the August coup attempt, Western financial experts, including the famous Jeffrey Sachs, found themselves in Moscow advising the new liberal elite on matters of market reform. Sachs and others vibrantly advocated for something called shock therapy. The idea was introducing elements of the free market through economic reforms as quickly as possible in order to facilitate the transition away from the state-run economy. The Western experts were joined by the most zealous reformers in the ranks of the new Russian elite. The most memorable of these economists were Gaidar and Chubais, whose names are still hated by many Russians today. Gaidar's first move in 1992 was to rip out price controls and subsidies. This resulted in massive 2,500% hyperinflation, which wiped out the personal savings of nearly all Russians. It's worth noting that some of the top figures responsible for the reforms also made good money on the side. Andrei Schleifer, Nancy Zimmerman, and Jonathan Hay actively enriched themselves by buying shares of valuable enterprises. It goes without saying that most of the domestic elite engaged in similar practices, thus benefiting disproportionately from their own reforms. Privatization and distribution of major enterprises happened behind closed doors, and only a select few had access to many important auctions. Moreover, companies were sold at prices well below their market value. In other words, the economic reforms were an opportunity for the international and domestic elite to rob the country of its previously public assets. The country was stripped of its infrastructure and industry, much of it flowing out of its borders into foreign accounts. The consistent failure of the reforms and the worsening economic situation created the grounds for a political standoff between the parliament and Yeltsin. The parliament frequently blocked the president's moves to privatize the country, forcing Yeltsin to rule by decree, which he was allowed to do because of the emergency powers granted to him in 1991. Those powers began to be seriously questioned, and as tensions increased between the legislative and executive branches, the country entered an unstable period of deadlock. The parliament and the office of the president acted in contradiction to each other, and looked for ways to solidify political control. The parliament, which was dominated by a left-wing coalition, mounted consistent attacks against Yeltsin and his team. On March 28, 1993, Yeltsin narrowly avoided impeachment. A national referendum was called on April 25th, which confirmed that the majority of the voters still supported Yeltsin and his plans to reform the country. Yeltsin clearly still commanded some respect from the people, though his status was greatly helped by the fact that the media was entirely controlled by his supporters. The conflict between the parliament and the president continued until September 21st, when Yeltsin announced that the parliament was to be dissolved and that he now had extended executive powers. This move violated a number of constitutional provisions and was by all accounts considered to be unlawful. The parliament responded by dismissing Yeltsin from his position and electing a new president, Alexander Rudskoy. Naturally, Yeltsin did not accept this development, opting to cut off electricity, communications, and hot water from the parliament building. Protests erupted across the country, all of them in response to deteriorating living conditions. Anti-Yeltsin protesters gathered at the parliament building, some of them armed, and were instructed by Rudskoy to take control of several key locations. Conflict at the Ostankino Tower, which was the center for many broadcasting programs, resulted in the deaths of 62 people, none of which were reported by the media. By that point in time, complete censorship had taken effect, and any anti-Yeltsin positions were strictly barred from airing. The parliament was unable to secure the support of the military, which ultimately cost them the whole conflict. On October 4th, 1993, the army ordered tanks to move on the parliament building. They began opening fire on the building in an attempt to get elected officials inside to submit. The Yeltsin camp won definitively, leaving in its trail 187 dead and 437 wounded. This was, by no surprise, a massive victory for Yeltsin, who managed to pass a new constitution in December of that year, which granted the president massive political power. If ever should there be a question of the origin of extreme executive power in modern Russia, the resolution of the 1993 constitutional crisis would be the unequivocal answer. And where did the United States stand in all of this? Well, some demonstrators of the 1993 unrest claimed that there was evidence of foreign snipers on nearby building roofs, picking off people in the anti-Yeltsin crowd. There's good evidence to suggest that there were in fact snipers stationed around the protesters, though it will likely be forever impossible to confirm their origin and identities. Such claims may be unsupportable, but we know for a fact that the US government backed Yeltsin's actions. President Clinton publicly voiced his support of Yeltsin, and in a number of published documents expressed the US administration's approval of Yeltsin's actions, regardless of its costs. By the mid-1990s, the Russian people were feeling the full impact of capitalist freedom. Rampant poverty, hyperinflation, staggering crime, and mortality rates the likes of which Russia had never seen. The May Day protests in 1996 were especially violent, as many people took to the streets in defiance of what were absolutely unbearable economic conditions. In the summer of that year, the United States interfered in the Russian elections. Time magazine published a documented report of how the US directly worked to turn around the election of 1996 in favor of Yeltsin, who at the time had some 6% approval and was behind in the polls compared to communist candidates like Gennady Zyuganov. It looked like Zyuganov or another leftist candidate was going to win the election by a landslide. After a disastrous period of complete economic collapse, Yeltsin was seen by a majority of Russians as an incompetent, corrupt leader who destroyed the country. The White House eagerly offered to advise Yeltsin, who was seen as the best chance to stop the return of a communist majority in the parliament. A team of specialists was sent to turn the election around. Despite being unimaginably unpopular in the public eye, thanks to the efforts of the American team working for Yeltsin's campaign, the president was re-elected. There are a number of events that followed that might be worth talking about, but hopefully the picture is clear enough for us to move forward. What were the long-term economic effects of the 90s for Russia? There were many, but perhaps the most problematic were deindustrialization, privatization, inequality and systemic poverty, destruction of social safety nets, and the complete collapse of support for a number of dependent nations. Even orthodox economists observing the trends of the 90s in Russia conclude that the liberalization of the country was a massive failure. Among the most damaging of effects was the deindustrialization of the economy. Russia inherited a great deal of valuable industry from the collapse of the USSR, but instead of taking advantage of that, the reformers allowed enterprises to be sold off at criminal prices. The rapid and unequal privatization of Russia's industry dealt a permanent blow to the economy, fundamentally altering its composition. We can thank the liberal reforms of the 90s for Russia's current dependency on hydrocarbon extraction, which make up 59% of the country's exports. The ideological shift towards liberalism necessitated the retreat of the state from economic affairs in a time when its involvement was absolutely crucial. Budget cuts forced the shutdown of 80% of all scientific and technical institutes, creating a technological vacuum. The economic effects of deindustrialization cannot be overstated. Some scholars believe that the destruction of industry in the 90s was at the same level as the Great Depression or the Russian Civil War. From the 1990s to the 2010s, investment in the production of machines fell from 23.1% to 6.9%. Investment in light industry fell from 3.3% to 0.4%, while investment in the extraction of hydrocarbons for export increased several times over. The decimation of light industry means that Russia imports the vast majority of its consumer goods instead of producing them in the country. We have already seen that privatization in Russia occurred painfully fast and excluded the vast majority of people. And when we say that the privatization process was criminal, we mean it figuratively and literally. Some estimates suggest that by the end of the 90s, organized crime controlled 70 to 80% of all private banks. Since most major property was state-owned in the Soviet Union, very few laws were established outlining private ownership, let alone privatization. Nevertheless, following the collapse of the USSR, certain individuals were in a position to acquire a disproportionate amount of state assets, at the cost of large parts of the population not participating at all in the privatization. Privatization is perhaps the most serious consequence of Russia's market reforms. This is because it fundamentally restructured the economy. It is because privatization brought with it the necessary retreat of state involvement in the economy that Russia has fallen behind industrially and technologically. It is because of privatization that, as we shall see here in a moment, a vast amount of wealth has been concentrated in the hands of very few people. And it is because of the transition from public to private that many programs that were desperately needed to support the Russian people have been completely erased from the federal agenda. Privatization also greatly expanded the shadow economy. Illicit economic activity did exist in the Soviet Union, but only made up a small fraction, some 2 to 3% of the GDP. By contrast, the underground economy in modern Russia makes up as much as 40% of the GDP and involves around 9 million people. Additionally, since the market reforms, hundreds of billions of dollars have been lost through capital flight. In other words, a vast portion of the wealth created in the country is exported out and never crosses back into Russian borders. If privatization is the biggest underlying problem in Russia, then the biggest visible problem is inequality. Russian income in the Soviet period was largely offset by publicly funded amenities, facilities, institutions, free healthcare, free education, pensions and stipends, food subsidies, stamps, etc. These programs leveled the playing field considerably, which is why the 1990 Gini coefficient was quite low, suggesting a fairly equal economy. However, the gutting of the state spending has produced a highly unequal society. What was considered the poverty line and the minimum necessary consumption rate of goods was exceptionally high prior to the economic reforms. When the majority plunged into poverty by the old definitions, the administration revised the minimum standards. Even in the mid-2000s, when Putin's administration raised the minimum standards, they never were returned to as high a position as pre-reform Russia. Russia's gross domestic product is 6th in the world, but the GDP per capita is 49th. In other words, as a whole country, Russia produces a great deal of wealth, much of it from oil, but when we stop to look at how the average person fares, Russia slides down the ranks considerably. Of course, GDP measures are pretty inadequate and never paint the whole picture, but even this disparity demonstrates how unequal Russia has become. Half of the Russian workforce earns $550 a month or less, despite the fact that the country has 102 billionaires who own some $355 billion in wealth. What's more, the wealthiest 3% of Russians owned 89% of all financial assets in 2018. Put in different terms, the combined wealth of 98 of Russia's billionaires exceeds the entire savings of the rest of the Russian population. Neoliberalism leads to higher degrees of income inequality and lower social cohesion. At best, neoliberal ideology favors an indifferent attitude towards inequality, seeing it as a necessary byproduct of a liberalized market. In addition, neoliberals reject the welfare state because it interferes with market functions. These policy preferences inherently create an environment in which inequality is bound to expand. After the failure of initial reforms, officials, specifically of right-wing factions, remained eager to stick to a policy of stripping down all state-funded public benefits. When faced with problems of inflation and inevitable economic upheaval, they opted to force living conditions into a downward trajectory, as opposed to searching for alternative solutions. The Russian government isn't social in reality, only in name. While the Constitution formally reserves the right for all citizens to employment, healthcare, education, and so on, none of this is realized efficiently and fairly on a massive scale. This is not because of a lack of resources, but rather due to a deliberate lack of effort on the part of government officials, and an unfair and uneven distribution of resources. Socioeconomic benefits are given out only to the extent that they pacify the public, allowing the functionaries to pursue their own interests. Let's take a look at some graphs that illustrate some of the major trends in the 90s. Here we have crime and incarceration rates. Notice the sharp increase in crime during Gorbachev's perestroika. Crime continued to skyrocket throughout the 90s and into the 2000s. Russia came out of the USSR with 148.3 million people, but by 2009 it had 142.7 million. Though industrialized countries tend to see a slowdown in population growth as they become more developed, this drop-off was way too steep. Zooming into the demographics data, we see that the loss in population is not just about gradually declining birth rates. It is about a sharply increased rate of mortality. The simple truth is that many Russians lost family and friends throughout the 90s. People were killed by organized crime as well as random acts of desperation. Others couldn't afford food or shelter. Many spiraled into alcohol and drug abuse, which continues to plague Russian society today. The suicide rate in 1995 was a whopping 41.4, which is 4 times higher than the current global average. Naturally, people stopped having children, since life was barely affordable for even one individual. The combined drop in the birth rate and spike in the mortality rate completely destroyed population growth. A final consequence of the collapse of the USSR reached beyond the borders of the country itself. In the latter half of its history, the Soviet Union engaged in a lot of developmental aid abroad, supporting a number of developing countries with civil and military assistance. Soviet presence in the Middle East, Asia, Africa, and Latin America provided considerable stability for some countries. It also kept US interests in check. The collapse of the USSR meant that Russia and all the other republics had to withdraw from the world stage. As a result, dozens of other countries ended up in deep crisis. This was the perfect opportunity for the US and its financial institutions. They could now move into a number of regions entirely undeterred. This was made even easier by the fact that many struggling countries now had nowhere to look but the West. The extremely damaging austerity demands made by the IMF became increasingly promising for countries who were desperate to maintain some economic stability. Many powerless states slid into a deep dependency on Western capital. Those states that attempted to take their own path didn't fare so well. Think Syria, Libya, Iraq, Iran, the axis of evil. Some states like Cuba and the DPRK have managed to survive after facing massive food and fuel crises in the 90s. But the cost of that survival continues to weigh on those countries. The 90s became a fantastically profitable era for the United States and its partners. The void created by the collapse of the Soviet bloc provided optimal conditions for the establishment of a new, neoliberal world order, which Washington took full advantage of. When it comes to the political effects brought on by the 90s, the conclusions should be pretty obvious. Yeltsin's victory over the parliament and the United States' hand in rigging the 1996 elections set the stage for the political system we have in Russia today. It is a system that heavily favors executive power, which Yeltsin secured in his new constitution after shelling the parliament building into submission. It is a system where elections are farcical and the ruling party has de facto control over all political activity. It is a system where formal political opposition is nominal and carries no real weight in policymaking. We don't have to look any further than the history of Russia's election results. The 1996 presidential election sealed the deal for Russian elections. The emergence of United Russia, the country's ruling party, marked the definitive end of electoral competition. And it was not at the hands of the communists that the democratic process died out. No, it was the liberals, with the help and support of the United States, who created the Russia we know today. The work done by the American team in that election was carefully observed by Yeltsin's own team. Thus, it can be reasonably concluded that much of Yeltsin's, and subsequently Putin's, campaign strategies were born in the very office of the Americans who were hired by Yeltsin to change the outcome of an election he was in no position to win. Today, United Russia regularly secures electoral victories on the national and local levels. And though Putin has run as an independent in the past, there can be no mistake that United Russia is his party. Only very recent success in certain local elections, such as in Moscow's Duma, has demonstrated the erosion of the ruling party's political grip. But even there, the toothless opposition parties will have limited impact on policy-making decisions. The situation in Russia has been so catastrophically painful that even liberal onlookers cannot do anything but condemn it. However, instead of recognizing capitalism as the root of Russia's problems, they insist that the market reforms were just not done right. It is true that Russia's liberalization developed far too quickly and far too ruthlessly. So is it an anomalous occurrence in the history of liberalism? People who suggest that are overlooking some important facts. The first is the blatant and proud involvement of the best market experts from the West. The policies put in place in Russia were the brainchild of top-notch economists. The reforms were not conducted by some ragtag team of inexperienced college graduates. No, they were deliberately planned and carefully calculated projects, and ultimately they succeeded in doing what they were designed to do. Russia is now a highly privatized country with minimal regulations. The federal budget is very modest when it comes to social spending, but more than happy to accommodate the interests of big corporate entities. Second, the project in Russia was never aimed at establishing a complex economy that rivals its Western counterparts. From the very beginning, the focus was on creating an economy based on the extraction of raw materials. Russia has had decades to diversify and invest in its own infrastructure, but the ruling class has no real interest in working for that kind of change. For them, as well as the West, Russia's role in the capitalist world is best placed in producing cheap fuel. From a domestic perspective, the state of Russia's economy may make no sense at all, but when we consider how it fits in the global arena, we can understand why neoliberalism in Russia never bothered to profoundly develop the national economy. Much like in other resource-dependent economies around the world, it is neither in the interest of the foreign or domestic bourgeoisie to advance the infrastructure beyond its extractive functions. When we understand the way Russia is embedded in the international political economy, we can conclude that what Russia is today is its complete form. Modern Russia is faced with increasingly tense contradictions. The extravagant wealth procured through the exploitation of natural resources stands in stark contrast to the abject poverty many Russians find themselves in. The country's reserve of hydrocarbons is its ultimate strength and its inescapable weakness. In refusing to move beyond oil dependency, the Russian elite secures its power and digs its own grave simultaneously. Meanwhile, the ambitious promises of Putin's administration fail to be delivered year in and year out. Abroad, the Russian ruling class has been cautiously towing the line between conflict and cooperation with US hegemony. Many observers suggest that Russia is nearing a pivotal point in time. With inequality at the same level as it was in the early 20th century, some believe a moment of change is on the horizon. Left-wing circles have sprouted up all across the country, and general discontent towards the neoliberal status quo has been growing in the last several years. There are also many reactionary elements within Russian society, spurred on by the tireless presence of the Orthodox Church, and of course official state propaganda. As such, there is plenty of opportunity for Russia to degenerate completely into a fascist state. Much of what Russia is today echoes the old Tsarist slogan, orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. There's no point in attempting to predict a timeline for the decade that is to come. However, we can be sure that the contradictions creating political tension right now are not going to go away. If the last 30 years are any indication of the country's trajectory, the contradictions are only going to get worse. Russia's economic conditions very much resemble those of the many countries that have been experiencing massive popular resistance against austerity politics and neoliberalism. Thank you for watching, and until next time, remember, the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it.